All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Rain Marshall. I introduce myself in my native language. I am Yankton Sioux, and I'm coming to you from Eureka, California, Wiyot territory, known as Jojiji, a good place to sit and rest. And I always like to acknowledge the sacrifices that the Wiyot people have made in this area and the horrific massacres that they've endured since the 1860s, and to recognize that they are still thriving, are still surviving here in this area, and they are building their nation and creating a lot of exciting cultural revitalization projects. So let's remember and uplift the Wiyot people today. So today's workshop is sponsored by the Northern California Indian Development Council and the Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund. And I work for NCIDC and ACLU of Northern California, and it's a partnership that was created in order to help alleviate some of the disparities that Native American students face in the education system in pre-K through 12. And October of 2020, the ACLU published a report with extensive research for 4 years in Humboldt and Del Norte counties that outlined those horrific disparities that Native American students face in this area. And in all of California, we have the highest concentration of tribes and Native American population in these two counties. So it's a very diverse population of a lot of different tribes up here, and the Native American students are having poor outcomes in our schools, and it shouldn't be that way. So part of this training is to help give parents, grandparents, caregivers the tools necessary to know how to support their children in the federal laws that are protecting them through education, and specifically special education, students with different learning styles or learning disabilities, students on IEPs or 504s, or those in need of those kinds of services. Some other work that we do at NCIDC through the Indigenous Education Advocacy Project is to attend SARB meetings or truancy meetings or student study team meetings to help be advocates for parents, caregivers, and students. We also address issues of racial discrimination in the school system. So I'm going to give my contact information on these slides at the end. And if there's anything that's parents, caregivers, grandparents, or students need help with in those areas, please feel free to reach out to me or to the experts from DREDF. Again, DREDF is a law firm. They have done a lot of change throughout the nation regarding disability rights and education law and those legal rights. So with that, I'm going to also let you know we are recording. We may have this recording available in 2 weeks if it meets our standards and is captioned correctly. And so when we get to some points about sharing, we want to pause that recording so we don't share personal information. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Cheryl and Diana. And so go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay, Diana, can you start with the next slide, please? All right, so as we begin, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit something you've heard before, but because we're doing this online, we had hoped to do it in person, but COVID-19 did not cooperate with us. Here's just a few pointers for today. First of all, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. We also, though, will take a break, and if you don't want to type it in the chat or for any reason that's challenging for you, you absolutely can unmute yourself and ask your question at that time. But please, if you have a question you want to ask directly, wait until the question and answer period. We'll also have another Q&A at the end. We wanted to say, as Rain mentioned a moment ago, that because we hope to make this available widely, we want to remind you to please not share information about your student or a child you're concerned about that would help identify them. We want to protect the privacy of our families and our students, and so try to say, you know, in our district, we're having this problem without using names or identifying information. In just a minute, we're going to administer a poll that will be like one question only. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to do another one. This is, oh, thank you, Diana. She's put it up. This is really just to help us know whether what we're doing is working. So we're going to ask you at the beginning, right now, as we start, how would you rate your knowledge about how to help students with disabilities and learning differences at school? And then at the end, we'll look and see if you gained in your knowledge. It's really important to us. You will receive a copy of this presentation afterwards, and it will be in a form where you can have it on your computer and you can click on the links that we're going to show during the presentation. If for any reason you don't want to look at it on a computer or that's challenging in any way, please email us. Our contact information is at the end of the presentation, and we'll mail it to you. That's no problem at all. It just means that those links you'll have to type them in yourself. And then finally, if you have individual questions, and we really want to emphasize that a big part of our goal today is for you all to learn more about what we do, how we can help, and spread the word. DREDF took over this grant just last October. We're serving 30 counties in Northern California. We're so excited about it, but we also know that nothing is more valuable than the word of mouth between one family that we've served and helped to another. So please spread the word about our services. Okay, next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that everyone can see the poll.
Yes.
Before I move to the next slide. And if you can, it's only one question. We just want to know, what is your knowledge right now about the topic? So 1 would be the lowest and 5 would be the highest. We really appreciate your input on that.
Okay.
And then I'll give you a couple seconds and then we'll move to the next slide. Can everyone see the poll? Just little thumbs up or not? I think, let me relaunch the poll because I might be having some issues.
It says that 10 out of 12 people have responded.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
So I think we're good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide.
And you can take the poll down now, unless you want to leave it up.
Should be done.
It's up for me.
Oh my goodness. Can you please take it down, Cheryl? I'm having issues on my end.
No problem. Okay, so let's talk about our agenda. We've already done some introductions and greetings, although Diane and I will introduce ourselves. Rain has already introduced herself. I want to say that our collaboration with RAIN, NCIDC, and the ACLU is really important to us. And as we get to know families and educators and community organizations on the North Coast, and especially in some of the areas that some of you are representing today, we're really seeing some of the problems that are written about in that report from the ACLU firsthand. And we also think that partnership and collaboration with education staff in these areas can go a long way. And we've already been able to make some really great partnerships. So we look forward to continuing to build on that. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about, after we do these introductions, some of the common problems and barriers that many families experience getting their students help with school-related problems. We're going to help you understand, this isn't a class in the law, but we're just going to introduce some of the really important laws just so you kind of know they exist. Again, you may not retain all of this, but you can just say, I remember something about privacy and I'm having that issue. That's helpful. We want to give you some tips about how to work with the school team and share what's important to you about your child, about your family, about your culture, to make sure that your concerns get into the conversation and that these conversations also stay strengths-centered. Our children have so many strengths, and often families experience problems at school as being just a laundry list of everything that's going wrong, instead of starting with what's working, what's going right, what are the students' strengths. We're going to talk about where do you go for help, which is really, the important thing. You don't have to know everything. You just have to know where do you go to get help or support when you're having a problem. How you can contribute to the school team and make sure that your issues and your child's strengths and challenges are front and center. You know, we don't have these conversations to talk about our budget issues. They are important, and we do a lot of advocacy on that end at DREDF as well. But what we're talking about in these kinds of meetings and processes is putting the student in the center and making sure the student gets the help they need to get the kind of education outcomes we want for all children. And then we're going to give you some tips for resolving problems. We're also going to ask for your input and feedback along the way, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so why don't we get started with these introductions? Diana, next slide. And Rain has already covered this NCID slide. I think we can just start by starting with Feather's story. If you go back a minute, Diana, just to kind of put us all in the right headspace as we move into this training. We just want to play a short video that actually Rain provided to us for another training, and we just felt like it really resonated. So we'll start there. This is very short.
I know I'm a child, but I see what is happening all around us. There's a sickness in this world, and it's not just a pandemic. There's so much devastation and pollution. How can our voices echo through the world? It feels like we are all divided. I remember my auntie telling me a story about the jingle dress dance being a healing dance. Her dress, footsteps, and the way she moved her fan offered strength and healing to the people. We need to think about Mother Earth and all her inhabitants. I pray that we can all unite and heal for the future generations. For more information, visit ncai.org.
What I want to do is take a minute to tell you a little bit about our organization and about myself, and I'll let Diana introduce herself. DREDF stands for Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund. We are a national law and policy center, and our focus is really on seeing disability rights through the same lens that we see all other civil rights, that they're human rights and civil rights, and that our goal is to envision and create a world where all people live full and independent lives free of discrimination, and educate people about issues that impact people with disabilities, and that includes children with disabilities. I will say also, DREDF has been working very hard. We don't just do education work, we work on housing, we work on transportation, we work on healthcare. Right now, we're working very hard on emergency response to make sure that that's equitable and fair, that people with disabilities aren't left behind in the fires and the earthquakes and the other environmental and emergencies that are happening. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can see the link to our organization overall down at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. And one of the things we do at DREDF is we do education support and advocacy through our Parent Training and Information Center. So a Parent Training and Information Center is something that is available in every state and territory in the United States. And very briefly, when these important laws protecting the rights of students with disabilities were being passed back in the 70s, one of the first things that parents and advocates in the community said is, well, this is all great, except that our parents are at such a disadvantage, because how will they know how to use these rights? How will they understand them? This is complicated, this is difficult. And so part of the funding for these new laws included funding to make sure that at least in every state there was one free center where a family could call and say, hey, I need help, or I don't know how to get started, or I'm dealing with a problem with my district. Can you point me to resources? Can you help me understand? And that's part of how we pay for trainings like these. We also talk one-on-one with families or anyone else who has a question. It's not uncommon at all for us to get calls from physicians, social workers, community members, relatives, and educators. And so we're happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk to us, although parents really are our primary focus. So this is our contact information, and you can call us or email us. Either way is fine. And we try to get back to you as soon as possible, usually within 1 to 2 days, although there's often certain times of the year where things get really busy. It might take us a little longer. Next slide. So before I begin here, let me just introduce myself. My name is Cheryl Thies. I am one of 4 education advocates who works at DREDF in the Parent Training and Information Center. And I have been at DREDF for almost 15 years. I have a long history of working around support for students with disabilities, especially kids in kinship care. I am myself a kinship care provider and adoptive parent, and students in transition to adulthood, and some of our more vulnerable families who are homeless or refugee, etc. I have 5 kids, and 3 of them have had either a 504 or an IEP for challenges related to a disability at school. And I remember when I started, and I remember how overwhelming it can be. And I just want to, make sure that you get the information today to help that make it a little bit less stressful for you. And then Diana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Cheryl. My name is Diana Vega. And fun fact about me, I'm a first-generation immigrant, hence the accent. I am a mother of 3 who I love dearly, and they all have disabilities. So I know what it's like to go to IP meetings, 504 meetings. But I do want to let you know that the reason why I do this work is because I'm very convinced that you as parents are the experts on your child. So please, please, please follow your instinct, even when you feel super lost. And then I also want to let you know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So my oldest is an honor roll student at the University of San Francisco with a disability, and it's taking a lot of tears and work, but we can do it. And she made the decision to do what she wants to do, and we're going to support her. So thank you, Rain, for inviting us, and thank you, Cheryl, and thank you all for participating and giving us the opportunity to present. And thank you, Cheryl, as well. So,
okay, thanks, Diana. Yeah, and I will say that the lived experience that we have, this is something that you just can't reproduce it, because when you've been through it, you understand that it's not just information that you need, it's also emotional support, it's also paying it forward to help other families. So it's really, really valuable when you get involved, and there's ways that you can get involved that we'll talk about at the end too, to change the system and make it better for everyone. We didn't want to start today without just taking a moment to recognize that, especially recently, there have been so many, I don't want to say news stories, I just think uncovering of realities about what's happened to so many Native American children in the education system. And just to say that that's almost like an elephant in the room for so many families we've worked with already, which is, do we trust educators? Can we trust you with our children? Can our cultural heritage, our language, our stories, our traditions be respected and built in and integrated into the education system in a way that makes education meaningful for our children and isn't a way that their culture is removed from them? So I included a resource there. I'm going to leave it at that, but just to say that we're very aware of the fact that there's some bridge building and some healing that needs to happen between the education community and the Native American community, and there's a lot of historical and present day trauma involved. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to just mention a few of these, and if anybody wants to put in the chat problems that you think are really common, I think we have some diverse people from diverse backgrounds here today and different perspectives. But these are some of the common problems and challenges that that families call us about, or educators or other people. The first is communication. You know, communication is really hard. And sometimes you think you're talking to someone, but they're hearing something different than what you're saying. And this is part of why we really encourage people to write things down and clarify and follow up. Like, it was great to talk to you today. My understanding of what we agreed was this, just to check in. And also because special education and education in general is full of lingo and acronyms, and, you know, IDEA, IEP, 504, FAPE, LRE, these are all words we'll talk about. And it's really easy to throw them around and to forget that not everybody knows what they mean. And often our experience is that families don't ask because they feel like they might look stupid and they don't want to appear to be not knowledgeable or not educated, and so they don't ask. So communication is a big barrier. So is perceptions about students, you know, the idea that, you know, the student has autism or Down syndrome or a learning disability, and so therefore they're going to be this way. They're going to have these problems. Every child is different. Every child is different. And we can't assume anything about a child just because we know one thing about them, their disability or their learning difference. We just know one thing about them. We have a saying, I have a son with autism, and we have a saying in autism, the autism community, that if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. You can't say autistic people are like this, just like you can't say that about any other group. And then I know a lot of families in the on the North Coast that we've worked with have already shared, or we've seen firsthand, situations where people have felt like their input isn't being valued, that everybody just sort of smiles and nods and then moves on, or in fact that sometimes they feel blamed for the problems the student is having. You know, maybe it's because you're being, you know, your child's not with their biological parent and grandma's raising them. Maybe it's because you know, you don't read enough books to your child, and so on. Let's see. Are there any comments in the chat? I can't see any. So I'll just mention a couple more, but here's a list for you to look at. The other things we see very commonly are this idea that things will just get better on their own. And we hear this a lot with the Head Start and early childhood families that we talk to, especially in your region. That this idea that, no, we don't need to evaluate that student. They're only 3, just give them some time. Children will outgrow it. Or that, you know, this isn't the school's problem, this is somebody else's problem, and so on. And there are ways in which that can really backfire, especially because we know that helping a child through early intervention makes a world of difference. And then finally, a lot of families are very concerned, and I think educators too, about, well, if we evaluate the student and say they have a disability or a learning difference or anything of that nature, that somehow we're stigmatizing them. I told you at the beginning, DREDF's mission and philosophy are about treating disability rights as human rights and as a form of natural human variation. You know, if we all live long enough, we may be lucky enough to have a disability someday. So, you know, we really want to try to undo some of that. And families will call us and say, I don't want my child evaluated, even though they're being suspended or expelled or really being traumatized at school because it's so bad, I don't want them to have the stigma. And we really help parents understand how to work around that concern. It's not that it isn't a real concern, but it's something that I think we can work on. Somebody wrote administration on, let me make this bigger for myself, bear with me. The big one that I see are school staff or the administration blaming the parent for not providing proper parenting or discipline their children properly. Yes, we are seeing that at DREDF too as we talk to families, definitely. And you know, the trouble is, here we tell parents, you're an equal partner in this process. You're a critical member of the IEP team. And as Diana said, you are the expert on your own child. And often I'll hear those things being said in a meeting, but then the reality is that there's still this sort of, well, you know, we don't see that at school. Maybe that's really just a home problem, even though the parent's saying, wait a minute, it's whenever it's homework, it's about going to school. It's definitely related to school. There's a direct connection. So yes, that's absolutely an important part, Jim. All right, next slide. And then, it's really important to know how to identify what kind of problem or challenge is coming up at school. So we're going to talk about all these. I won't go through them here, but I wanted to give you a short list. These are some of the big categories of problems that families encounter. Things like privacy, making sure that your students' records, if you do want your child to, or agree to have your child evaluated, you don't want anybody in the world to just be able to see that information. Being able to challenge records when they're incorrect. I see this all the time, and knowing how to handle that. Issues around the district, and I should say two things that I forgot to say, forgive me. The first is when I say parent, I mean whoever is the caregiver that has the education responsibility for that child. That's what I mean by parent. And when I say school district, I'm including charter schools because they are public schools. So really what I should say is public schools. So compliance is when the law is not being followed, and somebody's just not doing what was agreed to in a plan, or they're not doing what the state or federal government requires. Sometimes it's about problems reaching out and finding children who may have needs, even if the family themselves doesn't know that they can come to you. Sometimes it's about developing an IEP or a 504 plan that really works and gets the child real progress, not just a little bit, but meaningful progress. Sometimes the plan isn't being followed. Sometimes there's disagreement about what a child needs, right? This is really common. I think my child needs speech therapy. The school does an evaluation and says, no, we don't think your child qualifies for this. And sometimes there's issues of discrimination. And discrimination around it's just like discrimination around race or cultural heritage or gender or anything else. So for example, I remember a child being told, the family being told the child could not go on the 3-day field trip that all the little third graders got to go on. It was an environmental education program because that child had an IEP and needed a one-on-one aid, and that couldn't be provided. And so the child couldn't go unless the parent was willing to come and be the one-to-one aid, and the parent had to work. So that's discrimination. You have created an opportunity for all children at the school, and you're singling out a group of children because of their disability and saying that they're excluded. So those issues also come up frequently. Next slide. We often want to get out the word about signs that a child might need some more help at school. And just because a child is struggling, obviously, it does not mean that the child has a disability, and disability has a legal definition in education. But not looking to see whether they do is kind of like showing up at an emergency room and having the security guard at the door saying, no, you don't look too sick to me, we don't need to see you. So we want to evaluate, and then we make decisions about, is this a child who needs more support, and what kind of support would that look like? So here are just a few examples of signs that a child may need more help, and we made a long list so that you could share it and look at it yourself. Certainly when a child just isn't meeting developmental targets, they're not communicating like a 3-year-old should. They don't have kind of social interactions and play skills that we would expect an 8-year-old to have. They're not progressing toward adulthood as a teenager in the way that's important. Can you go back, Diana?
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Obviously, the child's doing poorly academically is a big reason. They're not meeting standards, state standards, or they're getting low grades. But other things can be, they are showing more and more anxiety about going to school, being really resistant, having a lot of behaviors where parents get phone calls to come pick them up. And all of these things, teachers will often be the first ones to raise these concerns, where I'm concerned that there's something going on. But just remember that, again, early intervention, meaning getting in there and helping that child as soon as you see the problem, however you do that, and schools have various ways of doing that, it's really, really important, because the longer we wait to help a child, the bigger that gap gets, the harder it is to close it. So the wait and see attitude can really backfire here. Next slide. All right, so some of the ways that you can get help if you have concerns, and I should have said too, there's often people who are incredibly helpful about identifying a problem, such as a grandmother or a child care provider or a Head Start or other teacher, or someone at your community center or church or in your community. This information is often hard for parents, especially with the first child. You don't necessarily know that the problem might be something that needs more attention, but there's a lot of information that gets shared out there. So listen to it and take it into account. So when there are problems, other ways that you can get started to get help include reaching out directly to a teacher. Can we have a meeting? Can we talk about my child? I have some concerns. What's your perspective? What's your take? Let me share my perspective. And in these kinds of meetings, sharing with examples, specifically, here's what happens when we sit down to do homework. I notice that my child can pay attention to it for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then they just can't sit anymore. They've lost their focus. I'm really worried when we go to the park or birthday parties or other cultural events that my child seems to really be struggling with getting along with other children and avoiding social interaction and so on. It could be the teacher sharing things that they're seeing, but starting with that direct partnership with your teacher. The next thing that often happens is something, and Rain mentioned this at the beginning, that she sometimes gets involved with, is these student study or student success team meetings. They're called SSTs. These are ways to solve problems together with the school before or even while you're evaluating a child. So it's like bringing some key people together. It might be the principal, the parent, the teacher, maybe a school psychologist. It depends on the situation. Sometimes there'll be a behaviorist or other kind of provider to brainstorm. And that's how I think of these as brainstorming session. What's going on? What are some things we could try working together? How could we try to solve this problem? And these can be very helpful processes, but they're meant to be time limited. In other words, if you go to one of these meetings and you try the interventions and they're not working, there really should be a window. Let's get back together in 6 or 8 weeks and see how this is working. Not just, okay, we had an SST and that's where the process starts. It's really just the beginning. And we will say this later on in the presentation, but it's also important to know that if in the meantime you want to start an evaluation of your child to see if they might qualify for services like special education or accommodations in a 504 plan, student study team meetings can't stop that process from moving forward unless you agree to put the pause on that evaluation, and you should be very careful. That's something you can call us about if you have questions. You can also ask that your child be evaluated to see if they need this thing called the Section 504 plan. We'll talk about what that is in just a minute. It's not special education. It's a way of accommodating and supporting a student in general education who has a disability or impairment. And then finally, there's asking for evaluation for special education to see if the child needs an IEP. So these are some of the steps in the process. Next slide. All right, so I've talked a little bit already about what an SST is. We wanted to give you some information, and you'll see at the bottom of this slide a link to a more thorough description of what an SST is. But here's some of the things that often come out of it. Do we need a better family school communication plan? So maybe, for example, whenever the child's having a really good day, the family gets notice of that so they can also reward the child. Well, your teacher let me know that you did X, Y, and Z, took a risk, read something, did something challenging. I'm so proud of you. Sometimes it's something as simple as let's have the child sit at the front of the classroom, or let's sit them at the back of the classroom so they can take a break and wiggle a little bit without disturbing other students. Some of those basic interventions could be strategies that you try in an SST. Next slide. Keep an eye on the time here. And then there are people on an SST team. And again, this is when you're first starting out. You're concerned about a child, whether it's the principal or the teacher or the parent or anybody else bringing this team together. Sometimes a special education staff member is invited because of their expertise, and they may participate and say, based on what I'm hearing, I think we really need to fast track, start moving on an evaluation. We want students and parents to be invited to participate in this process. We don't want problem solving to be one way. We want it to be collaborative and in partnership with families. Sometimes things as simple as my child goes to after school tutoring at the tribal headquarters, and you know, if you could give me a list of things the child needs to work on, that I can provide that to the staff and they can help. So these meaningful ways of partnering so that information is shared. And you can invite people you think could really contribute to that discussion. So don't hesitate to do that. If you feel like there's somebody you need to bring, either because you yourself just want some support during the meeting, or because they know the child, maybe a child care worker or a family member, that's really fine and appropriate to say, I'd like to bring this person with me. I think they can contribute to our team. Next slide. Okay, so what happens if all of these things I've talked about already, having a conference, having an SST meeting, trying some things out short term, what if you feel like this is too important? You know, my child's being sent home from school, my child's not learning and getting farther and farther behind. I feel like this is an emergency. Then we want to talk about, you know, moving forward and saying, you know, look, I'm happy to have a meeting, more than happy to participate in an SST meeting. But in the meantime, I'm wanting to let you know that I want my child to be evaluated, and I don't want that timeline to stop. We're going to talk about what those timelines are, bear with me. But, you know, no, we're not willing to try things for 6 months and then come back and see if they worked. This is too urgent of a situation. And in those kinds of circumstances, waiting can really be a problem. So there are times when you want to put in writing that you want to move forward and get that child evaluated, and you should never hesitate to do that. And if the school says, no, we don't want to, they have to tell you why they aren't willing to and what their legal reasons are. And that's something you can call us about, you know, and help understanding why they're refusing, or help understanding how to respond to them and giving them important information that they can use to reconsider whether they should move forward or not. Next slide. Okay, so let's stop here. So far we've just talked about, you know, what do you do when there are concerns at school? And here are some of the preliminary steps and ways to get the ball rolling. So if there are questions, comments at this point, we'd love to hear them. And you can unmute and just ask them, or you can put them in the chat.
And then also feel free to raise your hand.
Which you can do using that little reactions button at the bottom. Yeah. Press it, and then you can raise or lower your hand. All right, Robert has for a quick question. Does DREDF assistance begin for K-12? Thank you for asking that. Yeah, we serve any child really from 0 to 26. Special education doesn't begin until age 3, but before age 3, regional centers provide assistance to children. So you can feel free to refer a family to us for any child 0 to 26. And if we aren't the right person to support for any reason, then we will know who to refer to from there. So please absolutely send them our way, and we can help them navigate what the next step is. Other questions or comments? You're very welcome. Go ahead. Yeah.
If Diana could pick a number between 3 and 19.
I'm sorry, Rain, can you say that one more time?
If you could pick a number between 4 and 19.
7.
Okay.
Rain's giving away presents, right?
Trying to. So this is the book, Laura. Give me your, send me an email or a private message, and you will get a copy of Kutcha Risling's We Are Dancing for You. All right, any other Q&A questions?
So I'm gonna stop here and let Diana take over. We're gonna get into some of the more technical information about the law. Please speak up, put it in the chat if we're using terminology or we say things that aren't clear, because we know that some of this information is very technical, but we wanted you to have it because information is power. And when you know how to use the right term, it really makes a difference. So Diana will start talking about the laws and how we use them to advocate for our kids. Go Go ahead, Diana.
Thank you, Cheryl. Um, well, first, I want to say I'm not an attorney, so I'm just providing you technical information about the laws and why they're so important for you to know so you can effectively advocate for yourself and your child when it comes to accessing the education. So there are different laws that protect children and students with disabilities. Um, I want to remind you that you do not have to know them all, but you need to know where to get help when you have a question about a law. The information about IEPs, in my view, is super overwhelming because you have to learn about all the acronyms, you have to know where to go. But then this is why we're here. Cheryl, Rain, and I are here to help you navigate the system because, like I said, education will open so many doors and so many opportunities. So some of the laws that that Cheryl talked about earlier is the student privacy law, which is FERPA, and I'll explain this in depth a little bit. We just have the list of all the laws, so you have them for your reference. We also have the National Education Law for All Students, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. The anti-discrimination laws, which are the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and then the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Then we also have the Special Education or the IDEA law, and the Homeless Students, which is called the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So the first law that we want to talk about is FERPA. This is privacy law that protects all students that go to a public school. And when we say public school, we also refer to charter schools. It applies to every single student, regardless if the student has a disability or not. If you live in California, every time you submit a written request to get the file for your student, the school district has to provide the records to you without delay within 5 business days. A parent or a student who's 18 or older could request these records. And then once you get the records, you can take a look at them, review them, make sure everything is in order. You can also request corrections. Sometimes they write your name wrong, your background, your information. Not only that, but sometimes if you have a child that has special education services, the discipline records are not included into that. Also, you have the right to share the information with anybody you want, and then you can withdraw that sharing at any time. And then the schools have an obligation to keep the students' information private and not to shame the student publicly or just say, you know, oh, by the way, that child has an IP or is different or not. That's why this law is in place. The other one that we have is the Every Student Succeeds Act. This one is to ensure that every public school provides quality education for every single child that attends a public school, and like I said, a charter school as well. So the purpose of this is to make sure that the students are able to make progress, including the students that are disadvantaged. And then some important thing to keep in mind is like low-income students should have the same opportunity. I mean, low-income, disadvantaged, vulnerable students, the students who get special education services, and students who have limited English language skills have the same opportunity as any other student. The other law is the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that was enacted in 1973. This is an anti-discrimination law. It protects every person with a disability that impairs one or more major life activity, and not being able to learn is a disability. This would follow the student throughout his or her whole life. And then in education specifically, this plan will remove the barriers to learning, and it will provide equal opportunities for the students to participate, as we can see on the picture on the screen. So any program that receives federal funding it means that a person with a disability will be protected by Section 504. That applies to public schools, preschools like Head Start, some jobs, community colleges, universities. And the purpose of the 504 plan is making sure that everybody has the same equal access. So leveling the playing field. It's not everybody should be getting the same, but everybody should have the same opportunities. Oh, sorry about that. So the 504 plan is a plan designed to specify or document what type of accommodations and support the student is going to need, so he or she could access the school and the education the same way as a student would do without a disability. This is not a special education plan. This is a general education plan. And like I said, it applies for public schools, preschools, college, work, community activities, university, you name it. So I'm going to give you a little bit, like a little example of what a 504 accommodation plan will look like. Again, it's very individualized. It's not one size fits all. But the plan could include something like more time to complete assignments, break during instruction. If a student has a health need, so helping getting medication at school, checking their blood levels, nursing care. If a student has allergies, provide a nut-free lunch table, or maybe training to staff on how to keep the student safe at home. I mean, not at home, at school, or telemedicine from home. And then it's not limited to just accommodations. Some students could also get services within a 504 plan, such as occupational therapy, speech, counseling, or behavioral support. Environmentally, it could be a quiet place for taking a test, maybe in large print. If you have a student with a learning disability that need a different type of paper, that could be provided to as a 504 accommodation. And then assistive technology, or AT, to help students participate like others. So voice to text, text to voice, noise canceling headphones, computers, pencil grips. This is a very short list of accommodations, but it's just a quick example of what a 504 plan should have. Also, this—
Diana, quick question. Sorry to interrupt, but
That's not a problem.
those 504, I know one or the other, IEP or 504, continue on throughout college and through the student's work life, correct?
The 504 plan does. An IEP plan will stop once a student either receive a high school diploma or exits the transition plan at age 22. And we'll talk more about the special education or IEP plan in a minute. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
question. I'm not paying attention to the chat. Maybe I should. But I'm sure Cheryl is paying attention.
I got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Also, schools should not discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity, even if it's actual or perceived, nationality, gender, gender identity, or gender expression, sexual orientation, religion, disability, or maybe association with someone that has the above list that I mentioned. And the school district policy applies to all school activities. So it's not just because the school ends at 3 o'clock and then from 3 to 5 they have an after school activities, so they can exclude a child based on a disability, race, whatever it is. It applies to whatever activity is going on in the school building. If you experience discrimination, We have link here in, thank you for participating. We're gonna make sure to share all the slides with you via email, and all the links that we have, you can access if you have questions. And the ACLU has a lot of information on how to file a complaint for discrimination in their timelines. Okay, so the special education, which is the IDEA, is short for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal education law. So it will follow the student wherever they go. And this is why it's very important that you understand it. Any eligible student will receive an IEP, which is called an Individualized Education. We call it program, but it's mostly known as plan. And then it would support the student make meaningful education to get a free, appropriate public education. And then the acronym is FAPE. It prioritizes the least restrictive environment, and we're going to talk about least restrictive environment too. Least restrictive environment will mean the home school where the child will go if the child did not have a disability. It prepares the student not just to go from year to year, but for the future employment, independent living, future education, whatever the student envision, with the support of the family. And then children who have IEPs are also covered by Section 504. So if you have a child who was receiving 504 accommodations, but later on you realize maybe the child should have an IEP, make sure that all the accommodations get transferred to the IEP. It is very important that you understand your student's IEP plan. If you don't, you should always ask questions, get resources, and expect answers in writing preferably. All right, so what is the purpose of the IDEA? So the purpose of the IDEA, like I said, is not to advance from year to year. It's to ensure that the student is able to progress, be included, and have educational opportunities, and make meaningful progress on learning. Is to ensure that the rights of every student with disabilities and their parents are protected, to assist any still localities, any public school or educational service agencies and federal agencies to provide the education for all children with disabilities, is to make sure that there's an assessment, ensure that they're effective, and their efforts to educate all children with disabilities. Next slide, please. Oh, and to make sure that all children have the ability to access a free, appropriate, and public education to meet their unique needs. So there's cycles.
Before you jump in, Diana, let me just say, when we talk IDEA, we mean the special education law, and that means the student has an IEP. So those three things, just to connect the dots. If a child's eligible for special education, they're being covered by this law, IDEA, and they have an IEP. So any of those three things means the child is eligible for special education. Go ahead.
But I also want to say the purpose of the IDEA is not to put the child in a box and then say this child is different. The purpose of the IDEA is to ensure that the child is able to take advantage of the educational opportunity and make progress, understanding its disability. So it's not stigmatizing the child or labeling it. Is to, like I said, ensure that the child has the opportunity to advance and make progress in the disability. Something that Cheryl always says, and I love it, is a child would rather be called bad than dumb. So when a child doesn't have the appropriate supports, will always act out rather than ask for help. It's really hard to ask for help, especially when you're little and you don't understand what's going on. So I want to mention that. Okay, so going back to the cycle of the special education. And these are for the timelines in California. I think you have to click, Cheryl. There we go. So it starts with having a concern. So like I said earlier, you as parents know exactly there's something wrong. So when you have a concern, then you put that concern in writing, and then you request an assessment. And we have sample letters for almost everything. And we put a link on that. Once you submit the written request, then the district or charter school has 15 calendar days to reply to your request, hopefully with an assessment plan or with a prior written notice explaining why they are refusing to do an assessment. Once you get the assessment plan and you understand it and sign it by giving consent that you are in agreement with the school district doing an assessment, then the district has 60 days to complete the assessment and hold an eligibility IEP meeting. During the first IEP meeting, the team, and by team, I mean the parents, sometimes the student, if the student is old enough, and whoever did the assessment at the school district will meet to review the assessment and make the decision if the child qualifies for an IEP or not. Once a team decides that the child qualifies for an IEP, then the team will determine the present levels, meaning like where is the child right now, what are the strengths, and what are the difficulties. And then you start developing goals. Then you talk about the supports and services. And the last thing you will talk about during that first meeting will be the placement.
And we just want to emphasize here that if you're in an IEP meeting and you walk in and it's very clear that your school has already decided where the right placement would be, right? So they come in, don't worry, we're going to move your child to this other school because they have a special program or whatever, without having discussed the child's strengths and challenges and where they are now and what their needs are and what their goals are. That's a big violation of the law, because placement is only a conversation we have after we understand as a team, including parent input, what does the student need. We're going to talk more about LRE, Diana, but I just wanted to make sure I said that. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the step number 7 then, because we want to let you know that you don't necessarily just need to have one IEP meeting. You always have the opportunity or the right to call an IEP meeting, check in with the team, see if everything is working or not, and then make changes to the IEP meeting. I hate that term, but it's true. The IEP document is a living, breathing document, and you can always make changes. So if you have another meeting, you can ask yourself or the team, do we need more information? Do we need other assessments? And then we'll talk more about the assessments in a minute. But I do want to say, so FBA stands for Functional Behavioral Assessment. ERM stands for Educationally Related Mental Health Assessment. There's assessments for any area of suspected disability. So if your child or your student is struggling in the area of reading and writing, then you can do an academic assessment and so on and so forth. And then every year, the school districts have the obligation to meet again and review the IEP meeting and see if it's working, and then what changes need to be made. And then the last step will be the school districts have the obligation to reevaluate the student every 3 years to determine if the student still qualifies for services and if the services and placement is appropriate.
And I just want to add here too, everybody, that at any one of these boxes, the team can get stuck, right? They can get stuck because the parent says, I'm concerned, the teacher says, I'm not concerned. They can get stuck because the parent requests assessment and the district writes back or doesn't respond to that request for assessment within the required timelines. It can be because there's an annual IEP, which means the one that happens every year, it's required. And especially, after our COVID last 15, 16 months, many evaluations have been delayed, many triannuals, meaning that every 3-year review have been delayed. So at point along this little journey or these charts, a family can reach out to us and say, hey, I asked them to assess and they said no, or hey, my child's triannual was due, but they said they can't do it for 6 months. So just understand, we hope this chart helps you understand what the timelines are, what the steps are, and these are just common areas where the team gets stuck.
Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so why are assessments or evaluations so important? I look at an evaluation as like the blueprint of building a house. If you don't have a good foundation, you can build a beautiful house, but as soon as you move in, it will fall apart. Same with the IEP. So the assessment will be like your first step. So you are part of the assessment. You have all this information at home and you can say what exactly is the struggle, especially after doing what a year and a half of distance learning. You can say these are the struggles and this is what's working and what's not. So a good assessment will be informal or formal. It would have someone observing the child at home, maybe having an interview with the parent, at school, reading the cards, the testing. The school district must do an assessment in all areas of suspected disability, not just in one area. Parents have to provide written consent or they have to sign and approve and agree that they're okay with doing the assessment. The school districts cannot do an assessment without parents' consent. Parents also have the right to challenge the assessment and request an IE, and we'll talk more about that in the following slide. And then it's also important to note that the school districts could not give you a medical diagnosis, and they could not give you information or try to persuade you on using medication as well. This will be an educational evaluation to determine what types of supports the student will need so the child can make educational progress. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and I just would add, Robert, you asked that very good question a while back, and this feeds into that too, which is the schools can't get into what the child's medical or healthcare needs are. And sometimes when they do, they go down a path that becomes parent blaming. You know, have you thought about medication for your child? Maybe your child needs therapy, etc. The school's obligation is to look at what's impacting the child's learning and education isn't just academics. So just a reminder about that.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Diana.
And thank you for making that comment, Cheryl. I also want to let you know that as parents, you have the right to share information from outside, but you can share whatever it is that you want to share. So sometimes it's important to share medical records, but sometimes they're not relevant. So I just want you to keep that in mind. So what is an IEE? An IEE is an independent educational evaluation paid by the school district. And this happens when a parent disagrees with the or challenge the evaluation or the assessment that the school district perform. As parents, we're not school psychologists, we're not experts, so we can only say we disagree with the assessment because the assessment is inaccurate, incomplete, or incorrect. And the district has only two options: funded, meaning they say yes and they pay for it, or filed, they say no and they have to take you to court. And do not get scared when I say court. It means the school district has the burden of proof. So they have to stand behind their assessment and say, we have done all of these and this is why it's so important. I don't want to rush us, but we have like 20 more minutes. The purpose of the goals is that they have to be meaningful and they have to make sure that the student improves. They need to be very individualized. And if anything, they need to be smart. They need to be very specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time limited. It's not goals that stay for the whole academic career, but they're goals to be met year by year.
And we always, go ahead, Dan,
I'm sorry. I was going to say it's important to know, and I'm saying this from my own experience as an immigrant and not someone that grew up in this culture, that you prioritize what's important for your family and what are your values. For me, in my culture, is we're like very family oriented. So we are okay if our child turns 18 and lives at home until they're ready to go. So we want them, it's not that we don't want them to be independent. It's like, that's our values. We value mental health and togetherness. And we know that it might take a little longer for a child. So that's why it's super important that you keep that in mind when developing a goal. And if something doesn't sound right, speak up and say, I don't agree with that goal. Maybe let's rephrase it. Cheryl, did you have something to add?
Just to say that the goals drive all the services. So sometimes what we see in IEPs, and I've seen this a lot working and participating in some IEPs up in the North Coast recently, are very low expectations for the child. So, you know, if the goal is the child learns 20 sight words this year, they're not going to need a lot of help for that. But if the goal is that they're reading at grade level and they're 2 years behind, they're going to need a lot more help. And so pay attention to the goals. And that's a frequent reason why parents call us, is they'll say, I went to an IEP, they have goals, I don't understand them, or I don't think that they're right, and so on. Go ahead, Diana.
Okay. I want you to keep in mind, if anything, an IEP and 504 plan are legal documents. So please, please, please take time to read them before consenting them. Please know, and again, I'm saying it from my experience, it took me a long time to realize that I was an equal participant in an IEP meeting. Sometimes teachers and educators make mistakes, and sometimes it's hard for educators to understand your point of view. So feel free to take it home, discuss it with your support system. If you need translation, get it translated. If something doesn't sound right, feel free to call us. We have our contact information at the end. And then also you can agree to parts of the IEP. Sometimes you're like, well, this sounds really good. I want to make sure that we start doing that. But I actually disagree with changing my child's school to a school that's like an hour away from my home. I want my child to grow up with his peers or her peers, or play with his brothers and sisters. So you can agree with parts of the IEPs and then hold on to the other parts. And if you don't know how to resolve the issues, please feel free to call us and we can guide you to the right place. Okay, so Cheryl, do you want to talk about this, or do I do really want to hear from you what you have learned from us so
why don't we just go through this slide very quickly?
Okay.
And then we can get some questions and feedback. So just some basic advocacy tips. And these are skills that are really important for everyone to learn because they are useful not just in education. First of all, this whole process does have a legal part of it. So writing things down is really important. And this can feel awkward for families, but gee, I talked to the teacher, but I didn't write it down. But it's really, really important to do that, to say, thank you for meeting with me today. You said you'd sit Sarah in the front of the class, and that you would let me know every day how she's doing with her reading. I appreciate you doing that. When are we going to start it? That kind of thing. So put things in writing. Expect answers in writing too. We have a whole bunch of sample letters, you guys, and we've really tried to write a sample letter for pretty much any situation that comes up. So even if you don't find it on our website, you can reach out to us and say, do you have a sample letter about what I do because I want my child who's turning 18 to have more transition support or whatever it is. Get proof that you delivered things. So if you send it via email, which is what we're all doing these days, right? You can confirm, I sent you an email, can you confirm receipt? And you want to get answers back from the school district in writing. So there's a link here about what that should look like. And keep your own records. Parents have often powerful evidence, they just don't realize it, in photos, videos of their child. Sometimes I've heard teachers say, wow, the parent showed a video of that child and I had no idea, I've never seen them happy and relaxed. At school, they're very different. So all that information matters. And so asking yourself, how could you show or explain the problem, maybe even without words? Is there something else, a homework assignment, a video of the child that you could show instead? And then if you have problems, here are some of the common ones: not getting enough help. Services are being provided in a way that's not working for the child, and so on. So we wanted to give you a list of things to think about so you can consider what is the problem here. And then this just goes through what we already discussed. We wanted to summarize it. These are some of the things you can do to get help: requesting these meetings, requesting evaluations, contacting us at DREDF, please. Sometimes that's the best place to start. Make sure you get a notice of your parent rights and you actually ask them to explain them to you. Make sure you share your own child's story, including important cultural information and resources. You know, my child, Raina, I know you've been really wonderful in the few meetings we've been in together where you've said, you know, this child loves Yurok stories and mythology, and so I have a book that I provided that might motivate the child to be more engaged at school. Share that information. That's really, really important. And okay, so let's sort of stop here. There's a few more slides about information about what should be in IEPs. There's a new requirement, but we can just stop here and take some questions and answers.
No, just 1 second. I feel like we need to talk about this slide, and then we can move on to questions.
All right. Go ahead.
So there is a new requirement. It's called the SB 98. It specifically says that every single IEP should have an emergency section. So this requires that the school districts include a section that will describe how the services will be provided during an emergency when they have to close their buildings. In an emergency, is not only COVID, but it could be public health, fires, earthquakes, any other emergencies. So beginning October 1st of 2020, every single IEP should include this section. Like I said, it should provide a section stating how the services will be provided for that student. And it should also include some live instruction by grade during distance learning. So it's not just packages that are being sent home or recordings of the lessons, but also the ability for students to interact in person or online with their peers and teachers. So if you're a parent, please expect this at your next IEP meeting. And if this doesn't happen, ask for it and say, hey, I did not see the emergency section. How are we going to be providing these? And as a family, I want to make sure that you share your information, because sometimes we have two parents working outside of the home and they cannot be providing supervision during distance learning. So this is why it's important to have your family's input. I also want to say, if it's okay with you, Cheryl, we could stay for an extra 15 minutes for questions so we don't feel so rushed. Are you okay, Cheryl?
We can do that, but I also want to honor people's time. I know people took time off work and so on. Okay, and so we wanted to make sure that you also knew that there's other kinds of complaints. Sometimes you're worried that a teacher's not qualified or the student doesn't have access to instructional materials. This really came up during COVID, and I know it was a big issue in your area about making sure students had internet and making sure that they had laptops and all of that. So if you're concerned about that, you can read this information about what a Williams complaint is, and you can also reach out to us. And then our final sort of talking point is that we also really can't encourage families enough to get involved in reforming special education and participating in the process at a larger level. There are community advisory committees that are run by your special education units in your area, and it's a great way to get involved and raise issues, especially the issues specific to Native American children and the Native American community, which has really been left out of a lot of the decision making. You know, it's just like, how do we make sure that the curriculum reflects our culture? How do we make sure that teaching materials are relevant? How do we make sure that students with disabilities are included in all opportunities and not excluded from things that are happening? So there's information there about that process.